In 1953, the chief executives of the largest tobacco companies in the United States met at the Plaza Hotel in New York. They had a problem. A series of scientific studies had been published linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer, and the studies were starting to attract public attention. The executives hired a public relations firm called Hill and Knowlton, and what came out of those meetings was not a plan to make cigarettes safer. It was a plan to make the science seem uncertain. What they built over the following decades became one of the most studied and most copied influence campaigns in the history of industry. It did not require them to disprove the science. It only required them to make the public feel that the science was not settled. That turned out to be a much easier and much cheaper task than anyone who had not thought carefully about how public opinion works might have expected. The starting point is understanding what the science actually showed. And when, by the early 1950s, the epidemiological evidence linking smoking to lung cancer was not preliminary or suggestive. It was substantial. Ernst Winder and Evarts Graham had published a major case control study in 1950. Richard Dahl and Austin Bradford Hill had published a prospective cohort study in Britain the same year. Multiple independent research groups using different methodologies in different countries were arriving at the same conclusion. The association between cigarette smoking and lung cancer was one of the strongest and most consistent findings in the epidemiological literature of its time. This did not stop the tobacco industry from spending the next several decades claiming publicly and repeatedly that the science was contested, that no definitive causal link had been proven, and that more research was needed before any conclusions could be drawn. The sophistication of this campaign is what makes it worth understanding in detail. Hill and Knowlton's core strategic insight was that in a public controversy, the side that is losing on evidence can remain competitive by keeping the question open. You do not need to win the scientific argument. You need to prevent the scientific argument from being perceived as settled. A public that believes scientists disagree has no particular reason to change its behavior regardless of what the actual scientific consensus says. The instrument the tobacco industry created to pursue this strategy was the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, established in 1954 and later renamed the Council for Tobacco Research. Its stated purpose was to fund independent scientific research into tobacco and health. Its actual function, documented extensively in internal industry documents later released through litigation, was substantially different. The Council funded research strategically in areas where findings were unlikely to implicate tobacco, or in areas where findings could be used to suggest alternative explanations for the lung cancer increase. It publicized favorable findings aggressively and suppressed or downplayed unfavorable ones. It cultivated relationships with scientists willing to publicly question the mainstream consensus, and it provided those scientists with funding, speaking opportunities, and platforms that amplified their voices well beyond what their research alone would have warranted. This is the key mechanism, and it is worth sitting with. The tobacco industry did not need to convince the scientific community. The scientific community was largely not convincible because the evidence was strong and accumulating. What the industry needed to convince was the public, legislators, and regulators, none of whom read primary research literature, all of whom got their understanding of scientific questions from popular media and from what appeared to be credible voices on both sides of the question. By ensuring there were always credible-sounding voices expressing doubt, the industry could maintain the appearance of genuine scientific controversy long after any genuine controversy had effectively ended. The internal documents released during litigation in the 1990s made the strategy explicit in ways that are still striking to read. A 1969 internal memo from Brown and Williamson, one of the major tobacco companies, stated the strategy directly: "Doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. It is also the means of establishing a controversy." This was not an accident or a side effect of the campaign. It was the explicit goal written down by people who understood exactly what they were doing. The product was not cigarettes. The product, for the purposes of the public relations campaign, was uncertainty. The industry funded its own research institutes, cultivated its own experts, placed its own scientific spokespeople in media coverage as counterweights to mainstream researchers, and spent decades arguing in congressional hearings that the science was not settled enough to justify regulatory action. Internally, their own scientists understood perfectly well what smoking did. Documents later revealed that tobacco company researchers had been studying the health effects of smoking in detail for decades, and had arrived at conclusions that aligned closely with the mainstream scientific findings they were publicly disputing. The campaign was successful for a remarkably long time. Meaningful federal regulation of tobacco advertising in the United States did not arrive until 1970. When television and radio advertising was banned. The Surgeon General's report definitively concluding that smoking causes lung cancer was issued in 1964, 14 years after the major epidemiological studies had established the association. The gap between scientific consensus and regulatory action was not primarily a scientific gap. It was a gap manufactured and maintained by an organized, well-funded, strategically sophisticated public relations operation. During those 14 years, and during the further years between the Surgeon General's report and actual significant regulation, millions of people continued smoking in the reasonable belief that the science was genuinely uncertain. a belief they held because an industry had invested heavily in producing it. What happened next is the part of this story that extends well beyond tobacco. By the 1970s and 1980s, the tobacco playbook had been observed, studied, and documented well enough that other industries facing inconvenient scientific findings began adopting it. The strategic logic was the same in every application. You do not need to disprove the science. You need to manufacture sufficient doubt that regulation appears premature. The leaded gasoline industry used variations of the same approach when research established the health effects of lead exposure. The chemical industry used it for various compounds facing regulatory scrutiny. The sugar industry funded research strategically in the 1960s and 1970s to shift attention toward dietary fat as the primary cause of heart disease, drawing public and regulatory attention away from sugar's role, a campaign documented in detail by researchers who gained access to industry archives. The fossil fuel industry's response to climate science beginning in the 1980s followed the tobacco model so closely that historians and sociologists who study the tobacco campaign have described the climate doubt campaign as essentially an application of the same playbook, sometimes by some of the same individuals and organizations. Internal documents from major fossil fuel companies have shown that company scientists understood the relationship between carbon emissions and climate change clearly and relatively early, while the companies publicly funded campaigns to cast doubt on that relationship and oppose regulatory action. Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway documented these connections in detail in their book Merchants of Doubt, published in 2010, which traced specific individuals and think tanks moving from one manufactured controversy to another, applying the same strategic framework to tobacco, acid rain, the ozone hole, and climate change in succession. The same techniques, the same institutions, and in some cases, literally the same people. What made the playbook so transferable is that it exploits something real about how scientific knowledge works and how the public understands it. Science does not produce certainty. It produces probability estimates that update as evidence accumulates. Almost any scientific finding can be accurately described as not 100% proven because almost nothing in science is 100% proven in that sense. For questions with enormous financial stakes, this feature of scientific epistemology creates a permanent, exploitable gap between what scientists actually mean when they say something is established, and what the public hears when told that scientists admit they cannot be completely certain. The tobacco industry understood this gap and systematically exploited it. Later industries understood it too. You do not need to fund research that disproves the mainstream finding. You need to fund enough research in enough adjacent areas, publicize enough alternative explanations, and amplify enough credentialed skeptics to keep the question appearing live in public discourse, regardless of where the weight of evidence actually sits. There is a regulatory and institutional response worth understanding alongside the strategic one. The eventual defeats of the tobacco industry in court, particularly the state attorney general lawsuits of the 1990s that resulted in the Master Settlement Agreement of 1998, were made possible largely because internal documents finally became available. Once the documents showed explicitly what the industry had known, when it had known it, and what it had done with that knowledge, the argument that the science was genuinely uncertain became untenable to defend in court. The practical implication for other applications of the playbook is that the strategy depends heavily on the internal knowledge remaining internal. When internal communications from fossil fuel companies showed that their own scientists had concluded climate change was real and human-caused decades before the companies admitted this publicly, it created a version of the same evidentiary problem the tobacco companies faced in the 1990s. The lawsuits that followed and continue to develop carry a structural resemblance to the tobacco litigation for this reason. What the tobacco case established legally, and what subsequent cases have been testing in different contexts, is whether knowingly manufacturing doubt about a well-established scientific finding, particularly when internal records show awareness of that finding, constitutes a form of fraud or public harm sufficient to support legal liability. The tobacco companies eventually settled rather than fully litigating that question to conclusion. Courts in various jurisdictions are still working out versions of it in other contexts. The reason the tobacco story matters beyond its own history is that the strategic innovation it represented did not stay with tobacco. Before 1953, the standard corporate response to inconvenient science was largely either to quietly change practices, fight on the merits of the science where possible, or simply deny findings without strategic sophistication. What the tobacco industry, working with Hill and Knowlton, developed was a systematic, well-funded, strategically coherent approach to managing scientific findings that threatened commercial interests, one that could be deployed regardless of whether the science was actually wrong. That approach transformed the relationship between industry, science, and public opinion in ways that remain active. The tools it created, the industry-funded research institute, the network of credentialed scientific skeptics, the emphasis on uncertainty and the need for more research, the congressional testimony presenting manufactured controversy as genuine scientific debate, are now standard instruments in a recognizable playbook that appears wherever large commercial interests face inconvenient scientific consensus. Understanding it is not primarily an exercise in historical blame. It is a practical guide to recognizing a pattern that keeps showing up in different industries and different scientific contexts because it works. Doubt manufactured systematically and at scale remains the most effective product an industry can deploy when the actual science is not going its way.